Hello, my name is Nadine Bartlett, and I'm an assistant professor in the Faculty of Education at the University of Manitoba in the area of inclusive education. And on behalf of myself and Rebecca Herringer, a PhD student in our faculty, I am pleased to present on our research entitled The Duty to Accommodate Students with Disabilities During COVID-19 School Closures, a comparative analysis of education legislation in Canada. I'd like to begin my presentation by providing some background information to help to contextualize our current research. During the first wave of the pandemic, when schools were closed, we conducted a survey of 250 parents of children with disabilities from across Canada to learn about their children's experiences during this unprecedented time. One of the most startling findings from our research was that a majority of parents of children with disabilities reported that their children were not receiving individualized supports during school closures. In fact, almost 66% of parents reported that their children had not received their individualized education plan while schools were closed. And of those who had an individualized education plan, a further 80% indicated that their IEP had not been monitored or evaluated during that time. Comments like, all of our IEP goals were abandoned, or none of the accommodations on her IEP were addressed or delivered in a home learning environment were commonplace. Our study affirmed that a significant number of students with disabilities continue to face obstacles in their right to equal treatment in education, including their right to disability-related accommodations while at school. We wondered how this was possible in a country like Canada with such a firm commitment to human rights for individuals with disabilities. In our analysis of our findings, we applied the 4A framework developed by the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the right to an education to analyze these findings. The 4A framework combines human rights law and the right to an education into 4 interconnected elements that are essential in the provision of an inclusive education, including availability, accessibility, acceptability, and adaptability. The 4A framework, as it relates to the right to an education, includes the following principles. Availability. Is an inclusive education provided? Accessibility. Are there any barriers to access? Acceptability. Is the content of education adequate or inferior? And finally, adaptability. Are the needs of persons with disabilities taken into account? The lack of adherence to the 4 A's, as evidenced through the limited implementation and monitoring of individualized education plans during COVID-19, led us to our current research that we're going to share with you today. We conducted a comparative analysis of education legislation and regulations in each province and territory in Canada, and looked at the requirements for individualized education planning in each of those jurisdictions. Our goal was to identify the strengths and weaknesses in legislation regarding IEP planning in each province and territory in order to support the improvement of legislative mandates to provide accommodations for students with disabilities now and in the future. The duty to accommodate is informed by 3 guiding principles: respect for dignity, individualization, as well as integration and full participation. These elements are not mutually exclusive, but for the purpose of our comparative analysis, we chose to focus on individualization as demonstrated through the IEP process in the legislation in Canada. Before providing an overview of our findings, it is important to emphasize that education in Canada is complex and governed by many statutes and regulations, and it is also regulated by many government ministries. In Canada, there is no federal Department of Education and no integrated national system of education. The provincial and territorial governments have exclusive jurisdiction for funding, legislation, and regulation. However, there are some federal legislation, international commitments, and provincial codes and standards that are also applicable to education, and specifically the duty to provide accommodations for individuals with disabilities. For example, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees people's civil, political, and equality rights in policies, practices, and legislation of all levels of government. Specifically, Section 15, Equality Rights of the Charter, provides protection from discrimination based on disability. The Charter applies to publicly funded schools, colleges, and universities, and governments must not infringe on these charter rights. Canada is also a signatory of the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. This convention states discrimination against any person on the basis of disability is a violation of their inherent dignity and the worth of the human person. The duty to accommodate students with disabilities is also contained within this convention, meaning that accommodations must be provided in the manner that respects the dignity of the individual. In addition, there are provincial and territorial human rights codes and accessibility standards that mandate the human rights aspects of education services and access. Under human rights codes, there is a legal duty to accommodate the needs of people with disabilities to ensure that they have equal opportunities, access, and benefit, which are also applicable to education. And finally, the focus of our analysis, which is provincial and territorial education and regulations, set out structures for identifying and accommodating the special needs of students with disabilities. So we critically analyzed the individualized education planning legislation and regulations in Canada using the following criteria. First, we analyzed whether or not there was a specific reference in the legislation of the legal duty to accommodate persons with disabilities. We also looked at what are deemed the essential components of an individualized education plan, including a summary of the student's strengths and needs, assessment data, the need for individualized goals to be written in concrete, measurable terms, the resources required, the methods and strategies to reach the goals that are included, the identification of adaptations and accommodations, a description of the roles of each stakeholder, including parents, principals, teachers, specialists, and the student themselves, a review and evaluation plan with clearly articulated dates for evaluation and reporting, for example, annually or semi-annually, and the requirement of a transition plan if applicable. Finally, we also looked at whether or not there was school district and/or provincial oversight and accountability to ensure adherence to the IEP standards. Overall, we found that the strengths in the educational legislation across Canada, provincially and territorially, included a lot of specificity about the essential components that needed to be in an IEP. Most often, they did include the presence of timelines for evaluation and reporting, and a clear description of the roles and responsibilities of key stakeholders. However, the weaknesses included limited reference to the legal requirements to provide accommodations for individuals with disabilities, and a lack of requirement for school districts or provincial and territorial educational jurisdictions to provide any kind of oversight or monitoring and accountability to ensure that these practices were adhered to. These findings affirm the urgent need to strengthen education legislation to explicitly mandate the duty to accommodate through the IEP for individuals with disabilities. They further illustrate the need to ensure formal accountability and oversight by school districts and the provinces to ensure that the IEP process is adhered to and that the rights of students with disabilities are upheld. They also highlight the need to identify and mandate innovative approaches to individualized education planning, including individualized distance learning plans or individualized remote learning plans that include developing contingencies for in-person, hybrid, and remote learning so that support can easily pivot if required and remain responsive to the needs of students with disabilities. And finally, there is clearly a need to provide ongoing training for educators, specifically regarding their legal duty to accommodate students with disabilities as part of the IEP process. And at the same time, strengthen pre-service and in-service teacher training to ensure teachers develop both the core values and the competencies to employ inclusive approaches, for example, approaches like universal design for learning. In conclusion, while the expectation to pivot to remote learning during COVID-19 occurred quickly and without preparation, the inequities that this global health crisis have illuminated are not new, but rather reflect long-standing barriers in the educational system for children with disabilities. Our analysis highlighted the need to take corrective actions to strengthen educational policies throughout the jurisdictions in Canada to ensure that students with disabilities receive an equitable education that aligns with the tenets of the 4A framework of the right to education. As we continue to battle the COVID-19 pandemic, it is essential to acknowledge the human rights violations that have occurred and to protect the rights of individuals with disabilities to an inclusive, equitable education. Thank you very much. If you have any questions about our presentation, please feel free to contact myself or Rebecca, and our emails are contained below.